So welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Sarah Tenenbaum, and I am the Senior Director of Outpatient Clinical Services here at the Baker Center. So it's really nice to have the opportunity to chat with all of you today. I should mention, I think it's on one of my slides, that we're able to do some of these talks, this awesome educational series that we've been putting on this year for free because of generous funding through a grant that we have from the federal government, both SAMHSA and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So thank you to our funders for that. Just so you're aware, we are doing these talks once a month on a number of different topics that we think are hopefully relevant and applicable to either the work you do supporting children and families, or your work, the most important work as a parent of a child or an auxiliary caregiver. So we're doing a talk every month on a number of different topics. We are eager for feedback from all of you about topics that you would like to see us cover. And if you don't already follow us on social media, we hope that you will. Every time we do a talk, we are writing a couple blog posts about the topic in more depth. And we're also doing some nice social media blasts with really quick, tangible, bite-sized things about some of what we've covered. So I think we can put the handles for our Instagram, Facebook, Twitter in the chat. Alex will take care of that. And Caroline McDonnell, who's on this call, is our author of all of our blog posts, and they've been fantastic. I've learned a lot from them, so hopefully you will as well. So welcome. I introduced myself already, so already ahead of my slides, but it's great to see you. And again, here are our sponsors. And I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of like, how did I find myself doing this talk? And really, it was from many, many years ago in a lot of the work that I do, having caregivers over and over and over again say, screens are just a really big issue for my child, my family. I don't know how to manage them. I don't know how to monitor them. My kid might be more tech savvy than I am, even though they're only 8, which is quite impressive, but I think also quite true. And so I really took an interest in this topic to think about, like, what are we going to do with sort of the changing landscape of our worlds? Because I know for myself, I did not have cell phones and screen time and social media when I was a kid. And so it's really different parenting a kid with all of these, new tools that are so easy to distract us and so easily accessible. So that's a little bit where this came from in my work. And that was really pre-pandemic. And I think pandemic world and the access to all the social media has just exacerbated a lot of how important this all is. I wish that I was going to have like a very big answer for everybody about like, this is going to be the thing that is going to help you manage screens, from now on. But unfortunately, it's really going to be thinking a little bit about your specific family and child and some strategies that might just enhance the way you think about limit setting with screens. Okay. So I'm just going to start by this screen, these pictures. Like, screens are everywhere, and I don't in any way want to imply that I'm anti-screens. I think there are so many different things that has enhanced our world through the internet, through social media, through access to information. And I think, in our children and their developing brains, it is really hard for them to monitor and modulate. It's also very hard for us to do that as well. So, we want to think about some of the compassion that we have for kids. I was talking to a friend recently, and it's like, if I want my kid to be off the phone and I'm glued to my phone, what is that modeling, for our kids? But I need it, I'm an adult, and that might be true. And kids are growing up in a world where screens are really a part of their world in a way that, again, they weren't for many of us when we were growing up. My son is only 16 months old, and he already knows how to move around on the iPhone and change settings on things. I'm like, I don't even know how to change those settings. So it's pretty remarkable. But everywhere we go, where we see kids, and I do a lot of school-based work, a lot of school consultation phones are there. I have kids ordering DoorDash for lunch in the middle of the day, or, doing assignments on their Chromebooks and on their screens, going out to eat. And that is the sort of de facto tool to make sure that a kid is going to sit through a meal so parents can kind of enjoy themselves. So they're here, they're part of our world. They're not going anywhere. So we really need to think a little bit about how we're going to manage this new world and this new landscape that we are living in. And honestly, in a lot of ways, the science is still, the verdict is out. So a lot of this is we're learning information about the impact of screens as we get it, because kids are continuing to develop. So, again, I'm not someone who's anti-screens. And I think, every time there's new technology, our world says, oh no, is this new technology bad? Is this going to change things? And so even just thinking about, the advent of the TV, the radio, I'm sure there were very similar concerns and cautions back then. But if you look at the amount of screen time use, and that's what this graph is showing, in 1980, there was about a little shy of 16 hours of TV consumption weekly. 16 hours a week. 2017, so again, pre-pandemic, we were looking at more of about a 50-hour-a-week average use of screen time. That's almost 8 hours a day. Okay. And by screen time, I'm including TV, phones, social media accounts, computer use, all of the above. So TV is definitely included in that, but that's tripling the amount of average screen time use. So I thought that was pretty remarkable. I grew up in a old school household, no TV actually in my house. But we know that about 40% of young kids, 4 to 6 years old, have a TV in their bedroom. Wow, is that a hard thing to sort of manage? If you're a little impulsive kid, there's a big screen right there in your bedroom. I can imagine that being really challenging. The number just skyrockets as they get older and older. So about over 70% of 8-year-olds have a TV in their bedroom, and multitasking, or what we think is multitasking, because we know that we're actually supremely unable to multitask, but being sort of on multiple different screens, or having a screen and also trying to do homework or have a conversation, is something that we're seeing start really, really early, as young as 5 years old. Most teens own a computer, they own smartphones. Schools are even giving computers and Chromebooks to kids. And again, that's often how schoolwork has to be completed. So these are tools that are here to stay, and we want to think about how we control, how we manage them, and also the brain science behind the impact on our kids. Okay. So here are some icons that you're probably very familiar with. We've got TikTok, YouTube, Snapchat, all of the different social media, platforms that kids are on. As a clinical psychologist by training, some of my concerns are about the information that is out there. I'm sure there are a lot of concerns you all have as well. So, what is top of mind for the algorithm for your kid? What is it that they're searching? Do you know what they're searching, and what type of information are they getting on these platforms? So I know for us as a mental health center, we often have kids who are self-diagnosing because there are, quick little videos on TikTok that say, if you get distracted, you might have ADHD. Or maybe they're even more directive, like you do have ADHD. And so, I went to school for so many years to be able to accurately diagnose. And, in 30 seconds, we have sort of TikTok influencers who are telling our kids things that may or may not be true about their symptomatology. And so you really want to be familiar with what it is that your children are doing on these apps and platforms. And so right off the bat, some recommendations that I'm going to make are that you have the usernames and passwords for everything that your kid has access to. on their phones or on their computers and devices. Beware of the fake accounts that they might have as well. So if they know the mom monitored account, maybe they also have a fake Insta or Finsta, as they call it, account that you're not aware of. So really make sure that you are following all of those. And I would really make sure that you also have passwords, and that you have a plan if there are things that are inappropriate, or that you're concerned about what they're posting on any of their social media platforms, so that you can sort of take control back if you think that it's really not being used in a safe way. So, I'm sure I could get a list from all of you about why you're here and what your concerns are, but some of what we know already from the literature, and this is from child and family psychology, is that screens really have an impact on the brain architecture and structure for kids. And so we really want to think about this, especially because kids' brain is continuing to develop as they grow. And so the inputs from screens and from technology, again, can enhance that brain development in many ways and create some strong neural pathways. But there are also some things that we worry about, like poor sleep quality. So for instance, if a kid is on screens right up until bedtime, that actually stimulates the brain waves and makes it harder for us to enter into REM sleep, which is where we encounter that restorative sleep that helps us recover and be present and be awake and, sort of rested the next day. So there are some fascinating studies that controlled for wrapping up screen time use 2 hours before bed and actually seeing diagnosis rates of ADHD cut in half when screen time was better managed pre-bedtime. So really thinking about how it's impacting sleep. If there's a TV, if the child is using a TV as a sound machine, for instance, even if they are asleep, again, we're worried about the quality of that sleep if there are screens sort of on and active in the background. This has also impacted motor development, increased anxiety and depression. Again, if you think about what kids are seeing on social media, again, even for us, everyone else looks perfect, or it looks like they're having so much fun. I wasn't included in these things, and there can be a lot of stress and anxiety about why wasn't I there? Why wasn't I included? Why don't I look like that? I'm not as good as other people. And so things that might already be sort of percolating under the surface can really be heightened by some of what kids are consuming online. When I was in graduate school learning about abnormal psychology and all the different diagnoses, I was like, oh my gosh, I must have all of those things. So again, if kids are, hearing from TikTok influencers, if you get distracted, you have ADHD, and then our kids are so susceptible, like, oh no, what if I have ADHD? That could really spiral, a kid. And that's not how we want them to be consuming information about mental health, about news-related topics. Our world is full of lots of really scary and upsetting things right now. And so there's a lot of free reign on the internet. And again, we want to really make sure that we have guardrails and we're aware of what children are consuming. I talked a little bit about anxiety and depression, and I think that ties really well into sort of the impact of self-esteem. So is there a perception that they're being excluded from things, that they're not good enough? Is what's being projected online really accurate and true? And I think for many of us as adults, we're able to more accurately sort of consume that information and say, oh, that's something that's filtered, someone staged that photo. But for kids, they're really concrete thinkers. And so they're really less able to make those types of, more nuanced discernments about what is accurate and what's not. And of course, it's impacting school performance. So, I think we're sort of through the pandemic schooling, but the distraction of being, having to join school via Zoom, having media sort of at your fingertips, having web browsers there when you're trying to do your schoolwork, it's really hard to stay focused and to finish a task. And it's so much more rewarding to say, I just had a long school day, I'm just gonna hang out and spend some time on devices now, and then 2 hours could go by without even sort of noticing. So it's really hard to kind of have that sustained attention. It is impacting school performance. And there's even talk about sort of addiction related things to screen time, because a lot of the folks who are developing apps, websites specifically geared towards children are actually studying the neuroscience and saying, how do I help keep them hooked in? So for instance, if you notice that some of your social media apps refresh at a pretty quick pace, that's actually because your brain will get bored and you're looking for novel information. And so these app developers know just what that attention span is, and then they'll prompt a refresh sort of within that time span so that you stay sort of hooked in. So they are studying the neuroscience of how to get us sort of, into these devices and into these apps. And so we need to, again, make sure that folks are aware of the impact that it has on us, and that people are doing this in a deliberate way. Just like, the slot machines at a casino, for instance, that's sort of the same science behind how a lot of these apps are developed. So I mentioned that there are some actual neural connectivity changes when we are using screens and devices. And so this is actually, to me, a little bit of a scary slide about the impact on our brain areas. So again, the parts of our brain that stimulate pleasure and reward, these are exactly the regions of the brain that are lit up when we are on social media and devices, because they're getting a lot of stimulation, they're getting a lot of response. If you get a like, or someone's responding to something that you've posted, that stimulates those pleasure regions of the brain, and it helps keep kids especially hooked into these things. The areas of the brain that typically tell us, like, warning, this might be unsafe, this is something potentially dangerous, actually are not stimulated a lot of times by social media. So we're often sort of numbed out to those things, or again, not discerning, this is something that maybe I need to take a break from or look away from, versus something that's a little more neutral or benign. So I think for us as adults who can consume with a little bit more distance and space, that's really different from a kid who's just absorbing all of the things that are being presented to them. And, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of control once kids are on these platforms about, sort of where things go from there. So, I know the social media algorithms, it's like, are they listening to my conversations? Are they reading my texts? Because some of the stuff that comes onto your feed is so like spot on to what it is that you're paying attention to and focused on. But really what is coming onto a lot of those feeds, those algorithms, is what is most popular. So it's not filtered by fact-based information. It's filtered by what's going to, again, continue to keep people more hooked in. And as you might know, there's some legal stuff going on right now with some of the big social media platforms about not looking at children and teens differently from adults. And so they're really being seen as users for these platforms without guardrails around age being put in place here. In terms of the addiction frame, I think that this is interesting, that, the video games and, gaming through apps as well has become so much of a problem that actually the folks who write our diagnosis manuals have proposed having an internet gaming disorder being added into the next iteration of our diagnostic manual, because this is such a prevalent problem and has in many ways replaced a lot of the sort of typical interactions that are so crucial to child and teen development. And again, I think that the pandemic just really exacerbated this because in many ways kids weren't able to interact in that sort of normal face-to-face, outdoor play that was so typical of childhood development pre internet really spreading. And I think that took over a lot during the pandemic and then became a supplement for how kids interact and relate with one another. And so I have lots of kids who I've worked with where they have friends who they've met online through games, who they've never met in person, who they might never have had a conversation with, but they might think that's really one of my very good friends. And that might be true. There's so much facilitation, so much connection that's possible because of the internet. And there is also a lot of predatory behavior that's possible. And also just, kids being confused about what a real friend is, how to decipher, true friendship versus potential predatory or unsafe behavior. And also, for a lot of our kids where it's important for them to get out, get connected with folks. If they can just stay at home and stay on screens, if you're thinking about a kid who has potential anxiety challenges, depression challenges, that's really going to fuel those problems, because for those problems in particular, getting out and socializing are some of the primary ways that we can address challenges with anxiety, depression, and isolation. Okay. One more bleak slide before I go into some of what we want to do. So sorry, I'm bringing us real down first. But again, just some of the things, that we see when there's excessive use can actually impact physical health as well as mental health. A lot of times kids are actually posting about suicidal ideation on social media. I've had lots of parents learn that their kid had some sorts of, difficult thought problems because of something that they posted online. And unfortunately, a lot of times when kids post something like, maybe I'd be better off not here, or, I wish I were just dead, they get a really big response. And a kid who maybe feels isolated and then gets a big response when they post something online, boom, that was immediately reinforced. And so we don't want them to learn that's the only way that you can get help or the only way that you can get attention. I think I have mentioned most of these things as well, but one of the big ticket things that comes up with me a lot is my kid seems totally fine. And then when I take the screens away, there's this really big upset, this really big reaction. Maybe it's physical, maybe they're breaking something. And so I think part of the monitoring and management around screens is, how do I manage them coming off of screens? Because that can often lead to a lot of problematic behavior, even for really, really, really little kids. So, if you let your kid, hold your iPhone while you're getting them ready for school and then you take it away, are they slamming themselves on the floor? Are they screaming, even if they're an itty bitty? So this is starting young and continuing to be a problem into adolescence because it's so rewarding and reinforcing to be on these devices. Okay. So I have painted a bleak picture, but again, these are things that are here to stay, and many kids are using screens, devices, the internet for lots of things that are really beneficial and advantageous to their learning and their development. So we really want to think about who your child is when you're thinking about what you need to do in terms of responding. So on the left over here, I have some, characteristics of kids. And when I would say you want to monitor what they're doing, my recommendation is you're always monitoring what kids are doing online. That might mean, it's in a public place, or that you have access to their devices, again, passwords, etc., or that you take devices back at the end of the day so that they're not in a child's bedroom. But if they make friends easily, if they have a strong sense of responsibility, if they're doing well in school, they're participating in after-school activities, they have a solid peer group, there's a lot of stuff that they have sort of personal goals towards, that's a kid where, okay, everyone has a risk when they're online, but I would monitor, and I'd say there's lots of different social activities that they're doing, so a little less concerned. If you have a kid who's really socially isolated, maybe they're shy, maybe they, tend to withdraw or prefer to spend more time alone. If they're a risk taker or they're really impulsive, if they're already struggling in school, if they've been bullied, or are really focused on fitting in with others, those are kids who I really make sure that you're monitoring more closely. And also any kid who has a risk category, like if they're on the autism spectrum, where maybe they're going to have a hard time understanding some social nuances. These are all things that could put potential risk in place for them online. So those are some of my recommendations. Along those lines, the American Academy of Pediatrics has some really good goalpost recommendations. So they're really saying no screens other than video chatting with sort of a known family member or loved ones until they're 18 months old. And then up until 2 years old, really thinking about high quality educational programming, and ideally not programming that you're sort of sticking them in front of while you are getting dinner ready, but programming that you're consuming together so that you're aware of what they're watching, and then you can talk to them about any concepts that are being discussed. Of course, I know, sometimes as a parent, you just have to do what you have to do. So if you put a CoComelon episode on while you were getting dinner ready, that's okay. They're going to be fine. But I'd just say, as a rule of thumb, you don't want the TV or an app to be a babysitter. You really want to make sure that you're aware of what it is that they're doing. And then they're looking for kids 2 to 5 years old, about 1 hour per day max, and then 3 hours on the weekend. And really, again, thinking about what it is that they are using online. And then for kids older, they get a little goofy in terms of what those requirements are. But I think the big takeaways are having consistent limits. So one of my big things is always making sure that screen time or media use is something that is earned. So it's a privilege, not a right. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And making sure it's contingent on behavior that you want to see and that you expect your child to do. And also making sure that there's adequate time before bedtime for them to be away from screens. So this is really saying, from AAP, 30 to 60 minutes before bedtime. I would be a little bit more conservative and really say, an hour plus before bedtime, again, because some of those studies about the brain activity and how long it takes us to actually enter into slow wave brain activity after we've been on devices and been so stimulated by them. With anything, in parenting or working with kids, we want to also have open and honest dialogue. So, especially, wherever your kid is in the age range now, making sure that you're having conversations about, we can't always be on these things. This is why, I'm also taking a break from these things, and this is why. And so having that type of conversation early and often, and also explaining, if you handle this appropriately, I'm happy to give you more of these things. If we have a hard time, putting our screens away, turning the TV off, that's going to make it harder for me to give it to you again in the future. So really child-friendly language around that, and that's going to change. I saw that there was a comment, what's the difference between 8 to 10, 12 to 16? Again, you're going to modify your language a little bit more as they're younger and be a little bit more involved. You can give a little bit more independence and responsibility as teens get older, but always with the caveat that if you're concerned about misuse, if grades slip, if they're not socializing, if they're not engaging in activities, you're going to reassess the amount of screens that they have availability to. So I've talked about this a little bit, but in order to sort of set and maintain a conversation, this is not something I recommend doing in the height of an argument about screens when maybe an iPad's been thrown at you, or, the remote control is something being held hostage. At a calm, neutral time, you really want to talk with kids in a developmentally appropriate way about, all the things that are great about TV, screens, computer, internet, and devices, and some of the things that are scary as well. I would not lead through a scare tactic or, approach it exactly that way, but just say, my job as your parent or as your caregiver is to keep you safe. And to make sure that your brain develops and grows in healthy ways. And so, when you're 8 years old, the amount of screens that you can be on is going to be different than when you're 16 years old because your brain is in a different stage. And it's my job to help you monitor that and to find ways that you can do this in a healthy way. If your kid is really engaged and they want to, be part of this conversation, I think that's awesome. I once had a kid whose parents were really, really restrictive in the amount of screen time use that he was able to have. And he actually did this incredible PowerPoint presentation for them about, why he thought he should have more access to screens. And he had sort of a stepwise plan of, first, I'll start using it in public places in my home. And once I show you that I can do that responsibly, then I'd like to have some time in my room where I could be alone on devices. And so, if your kid would like those types of things, I think, that's a great way for them to learn how to advocate for themselves and show some independence, and perhaps look at some resources online, that might be helpful. There are also some great, tools. There's Dr. Rustin, who is the author of Screenagers, and she talks about Tech Talk Tuesdays, and really about how to have ongoing conversations with kids about media and about their consumption. I think a lot of the kids also who I work with clinically say like, yeah, I feel good when I'm on screens. I don't feel good when I'm off them. And sometimes they'll even say, I'm scrolling, I'm playing video games, and I actually really don't feel good. Like my brain feels like mush, or I kind of feel like I don't even know what happened, for the past couple of hours. So, really kind of getting a sense of what their stance is, because if you're like, these are just bad, most kids are going to say, no, they're not, and they're going to dig their heels in. So I would not get into, sort of a battle. But I might say, oh, like I was just on my computer all day working, and I really need a break from all that, white light, and I just need to go get some fresh air. And so you can do some modeling for kids too. So you could open the space for them to have a conversation of like, yeah, I kind of feel that way too, or that's really how I felt when I had Zoom school during the pandemic. So I'm really glad to be back in person. Okay. I think the slides will be made available for everybody afterwards. So these are just some, I think, helpful tools to build a sort of media contract and agreement with kids that they can really know, like, this is what's available to me. Here are the things that I'm expected to do. And here are the limits that I'm agreeing to. So if your kid's bedtime is 9 p.m., maybe you're setting a house rule that screens are done by 8 p.m. And so, that means that they're returning the devices back to your home, or you're taking all the, chargers, or, again, an agreement like this is what you get during the week, this is what you get during the weekend. And you could have all family members on this, kids of different ages. Of course, I think limits should be different for kids of different ages, but sometimes just having it out there, on paper or digitally can really help. So if you have a kid who's 8 and a kid who's 12, they might have different allowances on screens, but, you would sort of put that out there, make it known, and make sure it feels as fair as possible for everyone in your household. So in psychology, we talk about something called Grandma's Law. The formal term is the Premack principle, but it's called Grandma's Law because it's basically like, if you eat your vegetables, then you get dessert. And that's really what we want to think about. That's, if there's like one takeaway from this for me, it's making sure that any type of screen use is contingent on behavior that you want to see. Okay. So I said that earlier, it's a privilege, not a right. You all work hard to be able to provide phones, computers, devices to kids. It costs money. It is expensive. And so, we really want kids to understand it's not just a right of being a human that you get access to devices, especially not if you're a kid, but that it's like, if you do your homework, then you get some screen time, or if you're ready by 7:30 in the morning for school, you can watch the iPad on our drive to school in the morning. So it doesn't really matter to me so much what the contingency is, but the number one thing is that you make it, they show you a desired behavior and then they get the device. Okay. And you can always change what that is over time. But what you really don't want to do is here, okay, you can watch this screen while I'm getting you ready for school in the morning, but then you're going to have to do this thing, because if you've given the reward first, that's not going to work to get them to do that desired behavior. I also like to avoid negotiations, because a lot of times by the time we've entered into a negotiation with one of our kiddos, they are expert and we've already won that battle. So you really want to think about this in advance. If you're a multi-parent household, if you've got extended family or other caregivers, you want to make sure that it's clear and consistent across all of you, sort of what that rule is. So again, if you're ready, to go to school by 7:30, you can have 5 minutes of screen time. You don't want to get into a negotiation of like, but mom, I was ready at 7:25, so can I have 10 minutes of screen time? You want to keep that consistent rule, and then maybe you consider it at a different time, but you're not saying, okay, you can because of a negotiation. You're sort of saying, hey, I'm really proud of you, and I think you are now earning an extra 10 minutes of screen time starting this day. But you really want to be the driver of any of those changes. You also want to be really specific about what it means to earn screen time. So a lot of times we'll say something like, if you behave, you get screen time. Okay. But when, and like, what if they behave first and then they misbehave, and how do you sort of distinguish what that is? So instead, if you can be really specific, like if you spend 30 minutes doing focused schoolwork once you get home, then you can earn 15 minutes on your phone. So the more specific, the less negotiation you can get. All right. I like to make a chore and reward menu. I'll show you an example of one of these in just a second. But again, I think making sure that you have consistency across all the adults in your household is really going to be important, because if one person is, here you go, and one's a little more stringent, that's going to set you up for a lot of conflict. And your kid is also going to know, this is the person I go to, and this is how I push some of those buttons. So you really want to make sure you set that limit and you stick to it. There are also some cool ways that you can actually use the controls that are on devices. So you can sometimes power down other devices just from yours. So if part of the problem is, retrieving the device from your child who might be a better climber than you or sneaky hider, there is an app like the Circle where you can actually power off all devices just from your phone. So you don't have to get into that sort of physical back and forth. Or there are even some devices where you could sort of send a task of things that the kid has to do, like complete your math homework, take the dog out, empty the trash, and they can send it to the parent through the app. And if you see that they've completed those things, then you can unlock things like, Instagram or web browsers, etc. So, I really encourage you to look into some of those things to help, sort of ease some of the tension and the fighting that can occur. And even some just environmental control, like having a shelf or a drawer where devices are stored. Again, I would recommend not having devices stored in your child's room, or unplugging things, taking the chargers and having them. So, I'm so sorry, the iPad is out of juice. Nothing I can do about that. We're going to have to wait for it to recharge, and that takes quite some time. So that's a good way to help reduce some of the fighting that happens. So really quickly, I'm just going to go through a case example of a kid that I worked with a long, long time ago, but He helped inspire a lot of this conversation and work for me. He was a 14-year-old boy who had anxiety, some sort of autism spectrum flares, and social skills deficits, and he was spending more than 8 hours a day on screens, and his parents really said the only way he interacted with other kids was through multi-user games. Those were his friends. He was not interacting in any sort of in-person communication. Parents really felt like they had no control over his screen use. He was not sort of a active citizen or member of their home in terms of completing chores. And they had tried many times to limit his use of screens, and he would get really aggressive and actually did a fair amount of property damage. So it was really hard for them to think about, like, how do we do this, where we're keeping the physical safety of our house intact. And so what we did was we really went super slow, and we made a responsibility chart for him. So again, this is a 14-year-old boy, and it was like really simple tasks like brushing your teeth once per day. He would earn some points for it. And so you see here, he had points for earning his teeth once per day, brushing his teeth once per day. His mom was like, I'm mortified. I was like, hey, if we put it on the rewards program, it's more likely that he's going to do it. We even incentivized brushing his teeth twice per day because mom really wanted that, of course. Bringing his dishes to the sink after dinner, walking the dog. So simple tasks that he was totally able to do. And at first we made it really easy for him to earn the amount of screen time he was already getting. So at first I said to parents, look, if he does some of these simple things, he's already getting 8 hours of screen per day. We can keep it at 8 hours, but you're making it contingent on his behavior. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So he had 1 hour of screen time was only 1 point. So if he brushed his teeth in the morning, boom, he earned 2 hours of screen time. So that helped him buy into this without pushing back quite so much, because it was like, look, you're still going to get your 8 hours of screen time. Okay, but now you're doing things that make your parents feel a little bit more like you're a member of the household, and you're able to engage a little bit more. And we had, for sort of high ticket items, doing something social on his rewards chart. So that was really social without being online. So we were incentivizing some of the things that we really wanted him to do, and still making it so that he could earn the screen time he was already getting. So this is just an example. This can be a really hard thing to put in place. So if you have access to a clinician, if you're working with someone at our center, there's a lot more support we can do around rewards programming. But this is one example of a way to implement something like this. So sort of like what I just said, these can be really tough challenges that happen over time and get sort of maintained and built on. So if this is a struggle for you, perhaps it's a time to reach out to someone like us. We would often do a course of what we call behavioral parent training or consultation, where we can kind of walk you through a lot of these skills in much more depth and detail, tailored to your family. And if you're noticing that it's starting to be a problem, you're like, maybe we're not there yet where it's 8 hours a day, or we've totally lost control, but oh, I don't really like the way things are going. I would encourage you to like really monitor it earlier, because the sooner we can kind of get control over these things, again, make sure that screen use is contingent on behavior, the more able you're going to be to monitor, manage, and get it under control. But if it's gone on for a really long time, you might need some additional help and resources to manage this. So I will, for timing's sake, wrap up with the things I wanted to say there. My information is on here if you want to reach out to me directly, and we will open it up for questions.
Can we just ask a question?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, I'll put on my video. Oops, sorry, I'm just trying to undo it.
No worries.
So I have an almost 13-year-old, and I feel like at home, we actually use a point system. So anybody and we are working with the Baker Center, we'd instituted it before. So anybody who's considering this, I think it's awesome. And as the points, like as they get better at things, you'll move the points to things that are, as they start, like the example you're using to brush their teeth, you start doing more things where they're doing like a lot more chores around the house. But I feel that we're good at home. Our biggest problem is school. And our school doesn't, we're in a public school system. They don't have any limits in terms of like I've talked to the school. I've been very proactive. Like, can you ban YouTube? Or just for my son, do you have any like language I could use or any literature that I could take to the school? My background is in kids media. I worked for Disney, and my husband's worked for Electronic Arts for like 15 years. So we're very versed in how the neurology, what you were referencing about the neurology, how people look at that to see how they can hook kids on people in general, how the developers do. So yeah, just any thoughts on that with middle school computer use at school?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really great question. I was just at a local public school and the teachers were saying to me, like, we don't have any guardrails and, kids aren't paying attention and there's nothing we can do about it. So I think, I feel like there's something that has to be coming, eventually, because it just the unfettered access, I think is, parents are concerned, teachers are concerned. I think, Eliza, that it's really hard if your kid right now, if they have any special education supports, I think that would probably be your best entryway, is to say, because of my kids, brain structure, because of their disability, these are things that are really hard for them. So for instance, if ADHD was part of their profile, my child doesn't have impulse control. My child gets really distracted by these things. So, my child needs the internet to be turned off because of their disability, or perhaps even instead of it provided over Google Classroom, can you provide hard copies for my kid to work on? So that could be an accommodation or even an intervention that you have the school do. And again, you could just say like, hey, the data is my kid can't modulate those things, and they're not getting their work done. They're not focused in class. And so, that might be something that I would recommend trying, but I think it's really hard if the whole school is wired and you don't have, that sort of special ed stuff to fall back on.
Okay, so just a quick follow-up. They did take his computer away for like a week last year. And then of course, like the few days following that, he was on task. But then it went back. Do you think, like my stance now is they have a responsibility to like teach him how to use it like responsibly, because taking it away, he actually lost a lot of the work. Like so much of their work is done online that it was hard to transition back to paper, and he didn't really learn anything through it. So I don't know if there's like any thoughts around like having them do something daily. Like that's something that we've discussed.
Yeah, I mean, this might be a little more individual than I could get into sort of in this context. But I think, again, having a graduated plan, you might have to really be the driver on some of those things. And I do think it's really frustrating when kids can't complete their work without being online. But I know like there are some schools where they'll block certain websites, and they'll only have the things that they need in order to complete assignments. So I may work with them to make some, adjustments like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I see a bunch of hands raised. I'll go sort of sequentially. Karen, I see you first.
My question is about, I guess like the quality of screen. I've been a little bit frustrated that sometimes my kid is 3 at preschool and daycare, they do some screens, but sometimes they'll do like projection of stuff. And I wonder if about is it less rewarding? Is projection like a safer way to consume? I don't know, things.
Oh,
media.
I don't actually know, but I would say sort of group consumption is really different than individual consumption because you get hooked in a different way individually and then get really absorbed. And so, if a whole group is watching, there's a little bit more feedback, there's a little more dialogue about like what they're consuming. But then I think also, this is not exactly what you're asking, the content that they're consuming, I think really matters. So, are they just on the internet, it's open and they're exploring all sorts of things? Are they going to chat GPT to answer questions for their homework? Or are they using the internet to actually like access resources, read articles? I think those are like really different ways of consuming media. At 3, of course, that's not what you're thinking about. But even just like the education, the programming that your kid might be watching. So is it a more educational thing like Sesame Street has stuff on like race and culture at a really young age, versus just cartoons, which are okay. Everything doesn't have to be educational all the time, but you just want to think about limiting the stuff that's not educational.
Cool, thanks.
Jolie, I see you up next.
Hi, thanks. Question for you. What advice would you give to new parents with children in the 0 to 2 range, especially those who may be working from home, and so they are constantly looking at their screen, it's constantly on. At what distance is it still safe for the 0 to 2 to be in the room, but that it not be affecting them as much, or really should it be kept separate? And then just like any other thoughts as far as that 0 to 2 range and new parents like constantly needing to be on their screen or, having it in their house.
It's I've got a 16-month-old, so you're speaking to me, Jolie. I think, again, the AAP would say that your child is only consuming it if it's like they're FaceTiming with a grandparent or a relative. I think for all of us as parents, again, screens are here and they are necessary, but you also want to think like kids are learning and picking up everything that you're doing. So if you're not attending to them because you're on your screen, or, you're waking up to feed them in the middle of the night and you're just kind of like scrolling and you're not even aware of what your child is doing, I would say like that's probably a moment to be self-reflective and think about like, what am I showing my kid? But if you're sort of like checking things like, oh, is my spouse calling me and saying like, hey, do you need me to pick anything up from the store? I think that's okay. But you just want to think about how attuned you are, how present you are with your kid.
Right. Just a quick follow-up. So is there any like safe enough distance where like looking at a screen is not affecting the brain wave, or, the chemistry of the brain?
Yeah, I think in the like really early months where they're not like able to really take in a lot of the landscape around them, I think it's a little less concerning. But I would say like if you're in a room and you're getting dinner ready or something and you've got a TV on and they're over a year old, you probably want to think about, is there a way to keep that TV off while they're in that space? So really once I'd say they're past that 6-month mark, you want to think about like what devices are on and around in their environment. Can you replace it with like music instead of, the bright screens? Again, my son's 16 months and he knows how to turn on the TV with the remote. And it's like, even it just turning on, he's like, wow, because it's bright. He sees the little logo. So, we really would recommend just keeping those devices off. Certainly keeping like news, any adult sort of media off, even if you don't think that kids are aware of what's on it. It's really stimulating. It's really captivating. So we want to be careful. All right, Julie, I see you've got a question.
Hi, yes. My question is about Fortnite. It seems like my 5th grade boy is the only one in our school that isn't on it. And I kind of, even though all the other moms despise it and kind of regret being on it. So it just feels like it's inevitable. And how do I, keep a balance in my family life with it? Because it just seems to be like an extra bad platform because it's a first-person shooter game versus like Minecraft, you know, but there's a progression of video games as the kids get older, and seems Fortnite is on the doorstep. Plus I have a younger child in the family that I don't want exposed, but you know, if part of helping the video game experience is keeping it in a public space, how do I shield the younger sibling?
Sure.
So,
That is so hard, Julie. And I commend you on being, sole warrior in keeping Fortnite out of your house as long as possible. Because if you have the value that a first person shooter game is not appropriate for your fifth grader, which, I'd probably join you with that value, then I think holding on to that as long as you possibly can, I would totally support. Also knowing, and being sort of okay enough that like if your son goes to someone else's home, they might play those games, and sort of
right.
managing, you can control what you can control within your household, and sort of being okay that kids are going to have some exposure elsewhere. I think if you and your family think about like, is there a space where that's available? Then perhaps it's like, it could be in a room, but with a door open. So again, that you can observe, a lot of times in these video games, there are still chats that happen. So again, you want to be aware of like the kind of conversation that's occurring on a chat platform. Even in a video game, but it is okay, even if it's not popular, to just say those are games that aren't available in our household, and this is why. And I think we have enough data about just the horrors of sort of gun violence. There's not a link with social media or like video game use, so you don't have to be that concerned, but I think you could just say like, that's not something that we value, or that's okay in our household. And again, that might not be very popular, but I encourage you to hold strong as long as you can.
Yeah, I'm lucky. My son is very understanding. He doesn't like, push the issue with me. He's understanding. So I'm very lucky. And then I just hear from other parents that they keep the communal conversation on mute. And they said if they don't keep it on mute, they'll hear like terrible curse words. They'll hear the N-word. And I'm like, the only thing keeping you between your 10-year-old and the N-word is a mute button? Oh no. Yeah. Like, it's so scary.
It's really scary. Yeah. And I think, whether it's Minecraft or Fortnite or whatever the game is, again, making sure that you're around and there when your kid is playing and consuming, so that you understand, what that platform is like, so that you can really make informed decision about, what you want your kid doing, or like what the age would be when you would reconsider that.
Yeah.
What are the behaviors you want to see from them in order to say, this is something that I'd put on the table to think about.
Right, because Common Sense Media said 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
But this started showing up in the pandemic in third grade because it was like a social thing in the pandemic. Yeah. So I think I need to do like a half-hour increment of it when we get there, whatever day that is, and it be with a parent, and that's it. It's not like, okay, go play for an hour.
Absolutely. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think probably most of us are not following recommendations from the science about what we should be consuming online, for us as adults, but also for our kids. And so, your kids' peers are, I'm sure, doing things that would go against some of what I've mentioned here. And also, what things like Common Sense Media, American Academy of Pediatrics would recommend. And so it's really hard to go against that grain. And it's hard, for a kid who's trying to fit in a social world to say like, oh my gosh, I'm the different one, and safety, of course, is always paramount. So I think it's a balance to strike. And again, if your kid is responsible, if they're receptive, if they're open to those conversations, just like on that slide, like that's a kid to monitor, but not as closely. And it would be really different if they were sneaking, hiding things, already engaging in some sort of risky behaviors. So thank you all so much for the wonderful participation today. I'm noticing in terms of time that we are up on time, but it sounds like we could talk about this a whole lot more. So, please don't be a stranger. Reach out if there's more information on this topic that you'd like to see, or other topics. And thank you all so much for joining today.